What if you could teach someone what discrimination feels like in just a single day? In 1968, one elementary school teacher did exactly that, creating one of the most powerful social experiments of our time and forever changing how we understand prejudice. April 5th, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, third grade teacher Jane Elliott walked into her classroom in the all-white town of Riceville, Iowa, and faced a question from her students that many teachers would struggle to answer. Why did someone kill Dr. King? Rather than just tell her students about discrimination, Elliott decided to show them. What happened next would become one of the most referenced and controversial classroom demonstrations in history: the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. Elliott divided her classroom based on eye color. On the first day, she announced that blue-eyed children were superior to brown-eyed children. The blue-eyed kids received privileges, extra recess time, first place in lunch lines, and constant praise. Meanwhile, the brown-eyed children had to wear collars around their necks and faced criticism for everything they did. The results were immediate and disturbing. Within hours, not days or weeks, these 8 and 9-year-old children completely transformed. Blue-eyed students who had been friends with their brown-eyed classmates began to taunt them. Their academic performance improved. They became confident, even arrogant. The brown-eyed children, meanwhile, became timid and insecure. Their test scores dropped. They stopped raising their hands. Some even began to believe the narrative that they were less intelligent. The next day, Elliott reversed the roles. Now the brown-eyed children were superior, and the blue-eyed children faced discrimination. Remarkably, the pattern repeated itself. The newly privileged brown-eyed students began displaying the same superiority, while the blue-eyed students wilted under the criticism. But something interesting happened during this reversal. The brown-eyed children, having experienced discrimination themselves the day before, were somewhat less cruel to their blue-eyed classmates than the blue-eyed children had been to them. They had developed empathy through their own suffering. At the end of the exercise, Elliott brought her class together to discuss what they had learned. The students were emotional, many in tears as they processed how quickly they had turned against their friends based on something as arbitrary as eye color. What makes this experiment so powerful is how swiftly children adopted discriminatory behaviors. These weren't adults with deeply ingrained prejudices. They were children who, given permission by an authority figure, immediately embraced the idea that one group was better than another based on a physical characteristic they had no control over. You might think this was just a one-time demonstration with limited impact, but Elliott's experiment rippled far beyond that Iowa classroom. After being featured on The Tonight Show and in a documentary called A Class Divided, the exercise gained national attention. Elliott left elementary school teaching and began conducting similar workshops for adults in prisons, corporations, and government agencies across the country. Adult participants often responded the same way the children did, sometimes even more intensely. Corporate executives who found themselves in the inferior group would struggle with simple tasks they normally excelled at. Self-confidence evaporated, performance plummeted. What's particularly fascinating is that Elliott conducted this experiment before much of the research on implicit bias and stereotype threat existed. Today, we know through extensive psychological studies that when people are reminded of negative stereotypes about their group, their performance often suffers. Exactly what Elliott observed in her classroom. Stanford psychologist Claude Steele later coined the term stereotype threat to describe this phenomenon. His research in the 1990s and 2000s provided scientific backing for what Elliott had demonstrated decades earlier, that discrimination isn't just about overt hatred. It's also about how being labeled as less than can actually make people perform worse, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Critics of Elliott's approach have argued that the exercise is too emotionally traumatic, especially for children. Some have questioned whether causing distress, even temporarily, is justified as a teaching tool. Elliott has always maintained that temporary discomfort is a small price to pay for a crucial lesson about the destructive power of discrimination. What's undeniable is the exercise's lasting impact on participants. Decades later, Elliott's former students still recall the experience vividly. Many credit it with fundamentally changing their understanding of racism and discrimination. As one former student put it in a follow-up interview, "It was the defining moment of my life. I've never judged a person by the color of their skin since that day." Today, variations of the blue eyes stalks brown eyes. Exercise continue to be used in diversity training worldwide, though often with modifications to reduce emotional distress. The core insight that arbitrary division can quickly create real hierarchy remains as relevant today as it was in 1968. In our current climate of racial reckoning and polarization, Elliott's experiment offers a powerful reminder of how easily we can be conditioned to discriminate and how devastating those effects can be. As implicit bias and systemic racism dominate public discourse, the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment feels startlingly prescient. Now in her late 80s, Jane Elliott continues to speak about her experiment and its implications. When asked whether the exercise is still necessary in today's world, she typically responds, "As long as people are judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, this exercise will be needed." The experiment forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How would you behave if you were suddenly deemed inferior based on something you can't change? Or perhaps more unsettling, how would you act if you were given unearned superiority over others? What do you think? Does Elliott's experiment still have something to teach us today? Or have we moved beyond needing such stark demonstrations? The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment reminds us that discrimination isn't abstract. It's a lived experience with real consequences for how people think about themselves and perform in the world. Perhaps most importantly, it shows that prejudice isn't inevitable or natural. It's taught and reinforced, which means it can also be untaught and dismantled. Elliott once said, "I'm not teaching prejudice, I'm exposing it." More than 5 decades later, her classroom experiment continues to expose the psychological mechanisms behind discrimination and challenges us to confront our own potential for bias.